How is it that studios are able to take old movies and shows and magically increase their resolution to re-release them for modern screens? I mean, sure, anyone can take a low-resolution image and scale it up to fill a higher resolution screen, but these upscaling processes can't actually create new details that weren't present in the original. And yet, these remastered shows are in fact more detailed than the old versions they replace. So how is that possible? Well, to answer this question, let's take a look at what I think is a great case study for the remastering process: the Star Wars Skywalker Saga. All 9 of these films are marketed as being available in 4K resolution, but that doesn't mean that they're all created equal. Some of them are more 4K than others. And at this point, you might be expecting me to say that the original trilogy looks the worst out of the bunch because it's so old, but actually no. In fact, the prequel trilogy has objectively the worst resolution. To understand why, we need to talk about how film remastering works and doesn't work. So let's start by taking a look at the original trilogy. Like most films of the era, all 3 movies were shot on 35mm film. And this is crucial, because film actually has a much higher resolution than you might expect. Now, quantifying the exact resolution of film is a bit tricky. With video, you can count the lines, and with digital, you can count the horizontal and vertical pixels. But with film, the resolution is defined by the individual grains, the size, shape, and position of which vary not only from film stock to film stock, but from frame to frame. So coming up with an exact number to define the resolution in terms of megapixels is nearly impossible. But just to provide some context, a typical frame of 35mm film has at least as much detail as a 1080p digital image, and usually has as much detail as a 4K digital image. Now, that isn't to say that a 35mm film frame is the same as a 4K digital frame. It's a bit more nuanced than that, but for the purposes of this video, you can pretty much think of it that way. All this is to say, the cameras which shot the original trilogy did so at high resolution. So really, when we look at the remastered versions of these movies, the question isn't where did the extra detail come from? It's where did it go? And where did it come from, Cotton Eye Joe? If these movies have always been in high resolution, then why don't we remember them that way? At the conclusion of post-production on a film, the studio creates what's called a master. The master is a high-quality copy of the final version of the film, and is used as the basis for all the other copies which need to be created. But these copies of the master often don't retain all of the detail that was present in the master. For example, if you went to go see one of these movies when they came out in the theater, you were probably watching a 35mm film projector playing back a copy of the master. And so you might have expected the version you saw in the theater to have the same resolution as the master, but this often wasn't the case. Film strips may be capable of great resolution in theory, but as an analog medium, they're subject to degradation from a variety of sources. Generation loss incurred by copying a film too many times, spots and scratches caused by physical damage to the film, fogging due to improper storage, and so on. By the time a movie made it to the big screen, these imperfections could have easily degraded the image quality significantly compared to the master. And even if you did see a pristine copy of one of these movies back when they came out, you probably only watched them in the theater a couple of times. And for all the rest of those films' 40-year history, you most likely watched them on a TV instead. And unlike a theater, watching a movie on a TV imposed a hard cap on its resolution. Not only were the TVs themselves limited to standard definition, but the delivery mediums were as well. To deliver a movie to a TV screen, the master would have to be converted into a format which was compatible with CRT screens. Most commonly, the film-based master would be scanned by a device called a telecine, and then output to a video-based recorder. There were a wide variety of delivery options to choose from broadcast television, to VHS, to Betamax, to DVD, but all of these formats had something in common. They were all standard def. Back then, high-definition TVs basically didn't exist, so there was no reason for video-based workflows to support high resolution. No matter how much resolution the original master had, as soon as it was converted to video, all of that detail was lost, leaving nothing but the 480-ish lines of standard definition. And even if a particular viewer upgraded their TV to a high-definition model in the decades that followed, their collections of VHS tapes and DVDs were all still limited to standard def anyway, because that's all the information that was ever recorded onto them. So this is why so many of us remember old movies as being in very low resolution, because for the majority of the film's existences, the standard def versions were the only ones available to general audiences. But those original film masters were still out there, sitting on a shelf in an archive somewhere, waiting for their high resolution to be unveiled before the masses, waiting for the savior that would be HD TV. By 2011, more than 30 years after the original trilogy's debut, high-definition TVs were becoming increasingly common, and delivery formats were following suit. High-definition broadcasts and Blu-ray discs were reaching the mainstream, and the original 3 Star Wars films were beginning to look somewhat dated. So George Lucas decided that the time was right to remaster and re-release the original films on Blu-ray. By digging up all of the original strips of 35mm film, it was possible to re-scan them, but this time they would be scanned using a high-definition digital scanner. Instead of using the scanner to create a VHS tape or DVD, they would save a series of digital files containing every shot of the trilogy. Unlike the standard definition scanners used during the original home video releases, these modern scanners were able to capture much more of the detail that was present on the original film strips. They weren't increasing the resolution, they were just losing less of it. By taking these new digital scans and reassembling them in order, the studio created a new master copy, which existed in digital form and could be used to create Blu-ray discs and streaming releases, hence remastering. Now that isn't all there is to digital remastering by any means. Sometimes films needs to be restored before it can be scanned, old effects may need to be redone, digital color correction and noise reduction may need to be applied, or in this particular case, entire scenes may be added or modified, but that's a bit beyond the scope of this video. The point is, most of the quality benefits of a digital remaster come from re-scanning the original film at a higher resolution. And when this works, it can really work, elevating classic films to look great on modern HD or 4K screens. In the case of the original trilogy, setting aside all of the controversial extra changes made by George Lucas, both the 2011 HD remaster and the 2019 4K remaster look great. But this isn't applicable to the entire saga. Like I mentioned at the start of this video, the prequel trilogy has objectively inferior resolution when compared to the originals. So why is that? Well, there are 2 main reasons, and the first one has to do with digital effects. The practical effects used in the original trilogy were created using 35mm film as a medium for capturing elements and compositing them together. So all of the effect shots benefit from the high resolution of 35mm film, and can be remastered in a similar manner to the live-action footage. By contrast, the prequel trilogy made extensive use of digital effects and animation. And in order for these effects to make their way out of graphics software and into the finished film, they had to be rendered. Basically, the various 3D models, effects, and other instructions had to be processed and converted into static 2D images, which could be incorporated into the film. And this process is incredibly computationally demanding. It isn't uncommon for literal supercomputers to spend hours rendering a single frame at full quality. This is a digital process, so the rendering of a scene must be done at a specifically defined resolution. And the higher this resolution is, the more pixels the computer will have to process and the longer the rendering process will take. So unlike old school analog techniques, digital workflows introduce a strong incentive to make sure the resolution is no higher than it absolutely needs to be. So for the prequel trilogy, all of the effect shots were rendered at DCI 2K, which I've talked about before in a previous video. In practical terms, DCI 2K is very similar to 1080p in terms of detail. And this was enough for the effect shots to look good on the theater and TV screens of the day, but it is a noticeably lower resolution than modern 4K screens are capable of. The only way to increase the resolution of these shots would be to re-render them at 4K, which is theoretically possible, but would be very expensive, especially compared to the relatively low budgets often given to remastering projects. And the problems don't stop there, because even the few shots without any digital effects still have resolution problems to contend with. While The Phantom Menace was shot primarily on 35mm film, just like the original trilogy, and could theoretically benefit from rescanning, the other two films weren't so lucky, because they were shot entirely on digital cameras. Specifically, the Sony Cine-Alta HDW f900 on Attack of the Clones, and the HTC f950 on Revenge of the Sith. These were some of the first digital cameras to offer serious competition to film in terms of image quality. Shooting an entire feature film on digital was revolutionary for the time and came with numerous advantages. I mean, the film industry hasn't moved to digital for no reason at all. But one disadvantage of the Cine-Alta cameras was their inferior resolution. The HD cam tapes used by the f900 had a maximum resolution of 1440 by 1080. And the HD Cam SR tapes used by the f950 had a maximum resolution of 1920 by 1080, both much less than the 35mm cameras used in years prior. And this means that there never was an Ultra HD version of any of these shots. That information was simply never recorded by the camera. So the studio's only choice was to take the original 2K digital intermediate and try to upscale it to 4K. And this sort of works, since modern upscaling techniques do a pretty good job of sharpening edges without ruining the rest of the image, but the results are still noticeably worse than the other 6 films. And because of the way the prequels were filmed and produced, there's really nothing that Disney or anyone else can do to make these movies look much better. Alright, so that's the original and prequel trilogies covered, but what about the more recent sequel trilogy? Well, here the answer is pretty simple. By the time the sequel trilogy was in production, 4K delivery standards already existed, so the new films were produced with 4K in mind from the start. They were primarily shot on 35mm film, just like the originals, but post-production was done digitally like the prequels. This time, though, the 35mm shots were scanned into digital at 4K resolution from the get-go, and all of the digital effects were rendered at 4K as well. This did make post-production more expensive, but thanks to advances in processing power combined with a huge budget, it was considered a worthwhile investment. So, in short, the sequel trilogy never needed to be remastered because it was already suitable for modern screens. So, taking a step back to look at the saga as a whole, we can see a trend that is unfortunately repeated throughout the film industry. Older movies created using film-based workflows can be rescanned and remastered to reveal more detail than was present in earlier releases. And new movies, of course, are often filmed at high resolution, edited at 4K from the beginning. But in between the move to digital and the widespread adoption of 4K, there's this awkward middle zone of content produced digitally at 2K resolution, which will likely never exist in anything greater than its original resolution. It's not just the Star Wars prequels. More than a decade's worth of films will always be held back by either the limited resolution of the cameras used to film them, or the lower resolution chosen for post-production, or both. So I guess all that is to say, enjoy being able to look forward to remastered versions of your favorite films while you can. And if anyone ever asks you,
well, what's the point in shooting at 8K resolution if nobody has an 8K screen?
Just remember that there may come a day in the future where you'll be glad that a higher resolution version exists out there somewhere. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed this video. My name is Cayman Crocker, signing off.